I'll predicate all my comments on a quote from Alistair McIntyre, and that quote is, "One cannot answer the question, what am I to do, until they first answer the question of what story am I a part?" And so I think in many ways that the TMC is an unlearning and a relearning of a story. I came into the program after my third year of medical school, so I had had time to sort of be malformed and to learn a story about healthcare and about medicine. Um, and then to spend a year and a half with everyone, and to relearn a new story. And I think in so doing, what being there and being with all of your co-fellows and all of the wonderful mentors you sort of develop as a fellow, what all that does is inculcate those habits that end up being the tools you use to answer those questions. What am I to do when you're no longer with sort of proximally with everyone, once you're back in the re-entered the world of healthcare, if you will. And so I'll just give you a little bit of a picture of what sort of story I was living in prior to coming to the TMC. I had just finished my surgical ICU rotation as a sort of rising fourth year medical student. And I had been really excited sort of clinically about that work, but found myself incredibly overwhelmed and sort of overly engrossed in people's lives and in the patients' lives and in their families' lives, so much so that I was having dreams about them every night. And I remember talking with one of my attendings who I trusted, who said, well, the answer to that is just that you are young and you really can't get involved with people that way. You'll learn that. You just can't get involved with patients in this way. And so I finished the ICU on a Friday and started at Duke on a Monday. And so I arrived, and I remember actually hearing in one of our orientation sessions someone alluding to this idea of being present in encounters with patients. And I thought, you can't be present in encounters with patients because you'll just get too sucked into their worlds. And so I think that's a frame that so many of my colleagues have, because it's been sort of passed down. And then, in experiencing sort of the opposite of that, it's really tempting to buy into that narrative. And so within the TMC, I would say what we have done, what all of these mentors and faculty have done, and then what we sort of learned to do as fellows, is what Stanley Hauerwas calls performing the faith. He sort of talks about that as what the church does, but we do something very similar in that we learn these habits and we ingrain these habits in this new story of what medicine is and what healthcare is, so that in a time of crisis, i.e. when we're actually in encounters with patients and in conversations with our colleagues, we have the words to say and we have the vision to sort of see what else is going on in the room. And so I'll tell you, now that you've heard sort of what what kind of story I was living in before, some untrue stories that I learned the words to speak about, and to what sort of stories I learned to replace those with. So one is this idea that we cannot and should not bring our own values into our encounters with patients and our encounters with our colleagues. And that idea and being able to name the term secularism was really powerful for me, because what it meant was that I could relearn a story where, in fact, we are called to be exactly who we are and exactly who Christ has created us to be, and then to listen to who the Holy Spirit is calling us to be in every moment. And in knowing that secularism is not a true story, I think the TMC sort of gives us courage to live authentically and to be, now in the ICU. And this was a true story. And to be able to say, I think that everyone we're actually not doing the right thing for this patient. I think that our temptation to say that this patient's quality of life is so poor that we should let them just make a decision because it's what their wishes are, is actually a reflection of our temptation to think of quality of life as agency, and to think of someone's wishes as something that we should absolutely adhere to, even when we as their practitioners think that that for them and their communities there might be something more rich and something more full awaiting them. And I think the having just gone to the TMC, it means for a lot of people that there's an invitation to sort of realize that you are someone who has a story that very much involves value and involves meaning and is sort of against this idea of neutrality. And it invites them to think about their own values and their own meaning and their own sort of stories in a way that maybe the narrative of secularism does not. And so the second story I would say that's untrue that I found myself living in was the story of orphanhood. And I think as believers, we all sort of know cognitively that we are adopted sons and daughters of Christ, but it's very easy in the world of medicine, where often we are pressured to be efficient and we are implicitly or even sometimes explicitly told to live in ways that are not conducive to our well-being and to our care, to not eat, to not do things like sleep normally, that we can really easily understand ourselves and understand our stories as people who need to fight for ourselves and need to sort of just survive. And in many ways, that's sort of this orphan mentality that not only creates issues for our own well-being, but certainly creates issues for our interpersonal relationships with our colleagues and our patients. And the different story that I think I learned in the TMC was one of adoption, the reality that we all know as believers, but that to really live by is challenging in medicine, and to be able to practice and to sort of habituate that narrative during my time at the TMC, I sort of saw almost immediately the not so much the capacity. I would be lying if I said I was always hospitable, but to be able to at least recognize the moments in which I'm being an orphan and not living with a story of adoption and hospitality. And so I guess to conclude, I'll say that the value of the TMC extends so far beyond the time that you are in the program itself, because in many ways that's sort of your wax on and wax off, and the ability to really see those habits flourish and to see all that you've cultivated in a community suddenly sort of blossom, even once you are not proximal to that community, but very much still nestled within it, is such a gift and something that I would hope for all of my colleagues.